Hello, and welcome to this panel discussion entitled Classical Education and the Conservative Tradition, held at the Fall Classical Summit and hosted by Thales Academy, Rolesville. Today, we are investigating the relationship between classical education and conservatism. This is an appropriate and timely topic with rich avenues for discussion. The openings of thousands of new classical schools raises the question whether or not this brand of education is or should be aligned with the political tradition of one brand or another. Classical educators say they offer a traditional liberal arts education. Does that make classical education liberal? Classical educators say they are conserving the intellectual inheritance of the Western tradition. Does that make classical education conservative? Perhaps in the Edmund Burke way that he valued tradition, a sense of place, and one's intellectual inheritance? Could a content-rich education rooted in the great books of the Western canon, books that molded the minds of the Founding Fathers, produce a new generation of leaders who may cultivate the same opinions and values concerning the suspicion of government power, an esteem for individual rights and freedoms based on the Imago Dei, and a regard for the truth, virtue, and liberty? So this panel is intended to investigate these questions and the extent to which classical education is conservative and where along the conservative tradition we may find such principles. I'm very thankful for this panel of experts joining me here today to discuss this issue, whom I will introduce now. So Robert Luddy needs no introduction, but he's the founder of Thales Academy and the president of Captive Air Systems, a leading manufacturer of commercial kitchen equipment. In 2007, Bob opened up spare office space at the headquarters of Captive Air to found the first Thales Academy campus, which has now grown to a network with over 15 different campuses and serving over 6,500 students. Mr. Luddy, hereafter Bob, is an avid supporter of entrepreneurs and the free market system. He published his first book, Entrepreneurial Life, The Path from Startup to Market Leader, in 2018, and The Thales Way in 2023, outlining his philosophy on education and leadership. Dr. Jake Noland is the Dean of Faculty at St. Thomas More Academy in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dr. Noland was born and raised in Virginia and earned his BA in philosophy from the University of Virginia and his PhD in philosophy from Texas A&M University. He also holds a master's degree in public service and administration from Texas A&M and an MBA from the University of Richmond. Dr. Noland teaches a wide range of courses in the humanities at STMA, and we are very thankful to have him here. And we have Dr. Jenna Robinson, who is the president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, an organization that she has served faithfully since 2007 when she first began working there as a campus outreach coordinator. She currently serves on the board of the UNC Alumni Free Speech Alliance, the steering committee of the Bastiat Society of Raleigh. She also serves as a member of the Board of Visitors at UNC Chapel Hill and as a member of the Classical Liberals in the Carolinas. With her expertise and role in higher education reform, we are likewise thankful to have Dr. Robinson here. So we'll go ahead and start our panel discussion now, really just beginning by defining terms. So what is a conservative? The term is particularly weighed down with meaning and nuanced understanding, especially depending on the country that you're from and what you are trying to conserve. So to what extent, if any, does the definition of being a conservative overlap with that being a classical educator? Mr. Luddy, I open the floor to you.
So conservatives embrace the wisdom and knowledge of 2,500 years of recorded history. This is pretty simple. Somewhere around after 1900, progressives decided we don't need that anymore. They began to throw it in the trash. So classical education teaches us both the knowledge, the wisdom, and the unchanging nature of human nature. It never changes. And the more we read the Bible all the way forward, we realize, yep, this has happened before. So you think of Thales Amelitus, he didn't have the knowledge that we have, but he had tremendous wisdom. He accurately predicted the first solar eclipse in 585 BC. So for any scientists today that say, I think I'm equal or better than Thales, I would just provide one data point to them. It's pretty simple. So the fact should humble any modern person, including scientists. So if you think about Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, for anybody engaged in liberal arts or philosophy, they know these philosophers. And in the case of Thales Academy, we learn that, but we also use the Socratic method, which we were taught by Socrates. So history doesn't repeat itself, but it can improve our judgment because we see what happened over and over again. And part of education is improving our judgment. That part's been largely missed in modern education. So if you think of American history from the founding, it informs us why we have the greatest country in the history of the world, but it's not taught in public schools. So when people say, well, I don't really understand why we need an electoral college, we'll just get rid of that. We don't need senators appointed. That was a bad idea. We're doing democracy here, 1913. All of a sudden they begin to undermine what the greatest minds in the history of this country established for us, as a gratuitously for us. And for many of them, they gave their lives to do that. So to me, conservatism is classic curriculum, is classic studies, and gives us a much better chance in life to make good decisions.
And perhaps to summarize, it seems you're giving us the definition of, say, an Edmund Burke style conservatism, that there's a tradition that we've inherited that is immensely valuable for us to transmit and pass on to the next generation of students.
Yeah, someone said at a recent conference here at Thales College that we should take our decisions into account what our forefathers taught us, what's going on in current times, and what will happen in future times for our children and our grandchildren. All those should be taken into consideration as we make important decisions.
And I also picked up there too the idea that there is a definite human nature, and views on human nature change in and around the progressive era. And perhaps that's something that should be included in that idea of being a conservative. But Dr. Noland, Dr. Robinson, would you guys like to weigh in on what it means to be a conservative and what we're trying to conserve?
So I think, one thing in a nutshell about being conservative, and this is only one piece, was explained really well by G.K. Chesterton, with the concept of Chesterton's fence. If you're a progressive, part of your goal is to knock down all of the fences. And Chesterton says, before you knock down a fence, you need to know why it was there in the first place. I think that speaks to Mr. Luddy's example of the Electoral College. It speaks to the entire way we've set up our civilization. Don't try to knock things down until you understand why they are the way they are. And in order to do that, you have to study the past with the goal of gaining wisdom, not the goal of critiquing it.
It reminds me of the Anglo-Saxons wandering around the ruins of the Roman Empire and wondering what the civilization that produced these monumental structures and wanting to imitate them. Like they had to go back and study it if they were going to build walls and monuments and colosseums like that again. Dr. Noland?
Yeah, well, you kind of stole my answer.
Sorry.
Yeah, I should have gone first. But now I was going to talk about Chesterton's fence too, but I think that's really important. And when Mr. Luddy talked about human nature, I think that's a key. I would say that having this conversation in this political climate, you immediately have to clear away a lot of the confusion that we are not talking about is classical education Republican, because best I can tell, Republican Party is not conservative in any meaningful sense. So getting all that out of the way. But yeah, I think the sense of human nature, which is why we're able to read things like Shakespeare and get it, and why it is that we can learn from the past because we can see, oh, they tried this and it didn't work, let's say. And the last thing I'd say, I guess, about the sense of tearing things down is one helpful way a helpful example might be to look at the American Revolution and the French Revolution and how those ended up. Something that I did not get because I didn't have a classical education growing up was the realization that these were two radically different things. If you just look at it superficially, you think, okay, well, the French helped us and liberty, fraternity, equality, like this is great. It's basically the same thing, except for it was not. It was, we didn't have the guillotine and the reign of terror and so forth. Yeah.
And that is a fascinating contrast. Could you provide some more detail, like how the American Revolution was really one fought in favor of established principles, like Magna Carta, the rights of Englishmen, whereas the French Revolution were not only trying to tear down everything, but they instituted a 10-day work week, right? So nobody would know when the Sabbath was, so nobody would keep it.
Yeah, and I think that Russell Kirk talks about how the American Revolution was a conservative revolution in the sense that they were trying to conserve the rights of Englishmen, going all the way back to Magna Carta and so forth. And it wasn't maybe as pure as they might have desired to present it to be, but yeah, the French Revolution, they wanted to destroy everything, right? They literally changed the calendar to year zero. Right? So, and I think that speaking of classical education, when you read A Tale of Two Cities and you get that sense of the building mob and how scary that is, that would be an example of how you can learn something that's several hundred years old and have a sense of, okay, this applies today for sure.
Can I bring up one more point?
Of course.
The Romans were experts at pouring concrete, and anybody that's ever been to Rome would understand that. After the Roman Empire, the whole idea of concrete was lost. Near as I can tell, it came back in the early 18th century. Fast forward all the way to today, we don't know how to pour concrete at the same level as the Romans. Now, it could have been the aggregate, there could be a number of reasons for it, but we're not as good as they were 2,000 years ago. It's just one little kind of tidbit of explanation why you do not ignore the past.
Right, and you have to study it because some of the tricks that the Romans put together in pouring concrete involved putting things like empty jars to make the concrete a little bit lighter, but still give it that strong binding agent. Like you would never know that looking at the Colosseum, looking at the Pantheon. You have to read it in a book.
And think how wide those walls were at the Pantheon. They tried to partially replicate that at the Hoover Dam. What they did is they put pipes in there and they used them to cool so they could keep pouring. And then they later filled them with concrete. They poured soupy concrete back into them. So they did learn some things, but we still can't replicate what they did.
And so just to boil down, what is a conservative? There's a value for the past, for the tradition that we've inherited. There's a concern for institutions that promote human flourishing. We shouldn't necessarily tear them down in any way, shape, or form. And I mean, Dr. Noland, would you root your definition of a conservative in not an affiliation with a political party, but a commitment to, ideas, values, concepts that really promote human flourishing? Well,
that and the awareness of human nature in the sense that the crooked timber of humanity, right? The original sin, if you want to call it that, I would call it that, but one might not. But the point is that then makes you a little bit more cautious about tearing down fences and destroying institutions that have been successful and thinking that you can just do better. Like you mentioned earlier, the Burkean concern about placing too much power in the hands of somebody who you might think you agree with simply because you've seen how this goes in the past. So yeah, I would say that they really rooted in the sense of human nature and the fallenness, and so important of institutions and learning. I guess you could say humility would be a big part of that. Right, and I wholeheartedly agree there. And honestly, I love the idea of original sin. I feel like is really helpful to the classical educator in this sense that there's something kind of twisted with human beings. There's a natural tendency towards selfishness and perhaps looking out for ourselves. And that sort of natural tendency has got to be tempered with the kind of education that we have. Like that's, we speak of the will being bound up and kind of inclined to just look out for yourself and so forth. The liberal arts are really meant to be the arts that make one free, but we really get wrapped up in this idea, liberal arts education, that it's maybe wrapped up in the idea of being liberal, which is just this more associated with a political party, with a space on the aisle. Dr. Robinson, to what extent does a liberal education overlap with classical education? The liberal arts, is this a tradition, a living tradition, which must be conserved and transmitted generation by generation? And if that's the case, why must we do that?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with the first part. What are the similarities between a liberal education and a classical education? And to do that, I want to use Aristotle's definition of a liberal education. He says he divides education into liberal and illiberal. And he says that it is clear that there are branches of learning and education which we must study with a view to the enjoyment of leisure, and these are to be valued for their own sake, whereas those kinds of knowledge which are useful in business are deemed necessary and exist for the sake of other things. So I would say a liberal education teaches us how to be rather than how to work. according to Aristotle's definition. And a classical education fits in very well with that definition. Truth, goodness, beauty, virtue, wisdom. These are the things that a classical education wants students to leave with. And this accords perfectly with Aristotle's view of the human purpose. He says that human good turns out to be rational activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, or rational activity performed virtuously or excellently. And so I think using that Aristotelian definition of liberal education, we can see that liberal education and classical education they have the same ends. Teaching people how to be the best, most virtuous, most wise people that they can be. The second part of the question, is the liberal arts tradition a living tradition which must be conserved and transmitted generation by generation? And I say yes. The liberal arts, in order to be understood well, have to be taught as the great conversation. And the great conversation, of course, comes from Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was an educational philosopher who spent time at both the University of Chicago and Yale. And he says that the tradition of the West is embodied in the great conversation that began in the dawn of history and continues to the present day. And Mortimer Adler adds to that what binds the authors together in an intellectual community is the great conversation in which they are engaged. In the works that come later in the sequence of years, we find authors listening to what their predecessors have to say about this idea or that, this topic or that. They not only hearken through the thought of their predecessors, they also respond to it by commenting in various ways. And so that tradition that began 2,500 years ago is being built on by subsequent people who are continuing a conversation. I think that people don't necessarily appreciate that when you read something that was written by, say, one of our founding fathers, they are responding to an idea by Cicero. Or if you read something by even someone modern like Rousseau, who rejected a lot of the past, he's still responding and understood the works of the past and is writing with his understanding of those things in mind. And so I think that yes, it is absolutely a living tradition, and we have to keep it going by sharing and teaching the works of the past, but also preparing students to be part of that conversation themselves going forward. Because 100 years from now, some of the things that are being written today will be part of that great conversation. We don't know which ones yet, because I think they have to stand the test of time in order to be added, to the Western canon. And I'll add here that it's very important to focus your attention on those works of the past rather than exclusively on the works of the present. And I'll share a quote from C.S. Lewis. He says, "Every age has its own outlook. It is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period," and that means the old books. And he essentially is saying we have blinders on. We don't know what we're missing by being moderns, by being, creatures of the 21st century. And the only way we can take those blinders off is to read the works of the past.
Well, and I wholeheartedly agree in Aristotle's distinction between a liberal and an illiberal education, one that's valued for its own sake, for the sake of developing your character, doing good to your soul, and one just valued for its utility. Dr. Noland, at STMA, I feel like your institution really excels on the character formation, like shaping the hearts and minds of the students who go through your institution. So I'd love to hear your feedback, the idea of using works from the past in order to perhaps mold like a student's character today, but how does the liberal arts and what's your understanding of it, and how does that influence what you do day to day as an educator?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying we do that well. We certainly try to. I like the way you framed that, because I think that what it reminded me of was another essay by Lewis, The Weight of Glory, where there's an image he uses. I'll probably butcher this a little bit, but essentially of a child basically playing in a mud puddle, and is just thrilled, having a good time in a mud puddle. Has never been to the beach, right? And doesn't know that there's such a thing as an ocean and all that. Like that would be, So I think that one thing that we do when we give our students exposure to the great works of art is let them see something really beautiful. And it's valuable in itself, right? And so we're showing them that because essentially when they are on their phones looking at Instagram or TikTok or reading some YA novel, it's kind of like the kid playing in the mud puddle. But I do think you can also learn a great deal about character from literature in a way that is much harder to do with philosophy, let's say. And actually you can, ironically, kind of learn that through philosophy. I mean, if you, so when Aristotle at the very beginning of the Ethics is talking about how do we learn what a good life is, well, it's very empirical. We see the people who seem to have been living good lives at the end of their lives, right? And one way to do that is to observe the people that are around you, but another way to do that is to read about these people historically, and you can see what they did, and you start to see. It always struck me that Stephen Covey, when he did his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, was basically just reproducing Aristotle and bring it down a little bit. And so I think that that's something that literature can do, and history as well. History taught in a certain way, where it's not simply about this is a list of facts you got to know, but let's look at this decision that somebody made and why they made it, and we can learn from them in a way that could shape our own character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that quote from the opening chapters of The Prince. I mean, you have to read Machiavelli's The Prince very carefully, but he says part of the goal of history, you're kind of like the archer, you're imitating the archer who is trying to shoot at a target that's very far off, but if you're not attempting like so great an endeavor, like you're not going to come anywhere close to that. And I love those stories of noble character to try to give students like a template, a model for how they're about to go about their lives. Mr. Luddy,
one more comment.
Of course.
Jefferson allegedly told Madison, before you even think about writing the Constitution, there are several hundred books that you must have read. So don't even start until you've read those books. Mm-hmm. What does that tell you about our founding fathers? Everything, literally everything.
I think going back to the story of learn from great people from the past, one thing that almost all of them had in common is if they had the means to do so, they all had libraries.
Would someone touch on that relation, the liberal arts, the arts that make one free? Could someone speak on how like this sort of education is really meant to free the individual to pursue their talents, their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations? I love that. I feel like that really gets at what we're trying to do as classical educators.
Well, something that we have maybe more freedom to do being a Catholic school is to just talk very openly about Scripture and so forth, which I don't know that everybody has that freedom to do, but something I've been talking about with my juniors in the moral theology class is recognizing the ways in which we are not free. Because there is a sense that many people have that freedom is simply doing whatever you want to do. But you got to think about where those desires come from. And if you have a sense of yourself as fallen, you'll understand that a lot of your desires that seem to be innate aren't good and will lead you in a bad direction. And then much of our desire is simply mimetic. I had not heard about René Girard when I was in college, but at some point after that I learned about him and his theory of mimetic desire, and just that we imitate. And once you start to be aware of that, you become aware of the extent to which that you're not actually free, so that you might desire true freedom, freedom to be what you ought to be. And this going back to the notion of human nature, that as I am now is not how I ought to be. If you don't have some awareness of that, you don't have the sense of the necessity of growing, and you wouldn't know which direction to try to grow in anyway.
Mr. Luddy, would you speak on that?
Did anybody hear the term ignorance is bliss? You heard that? Well, do you know any ignorant people that are blissful? I don't know a single one. So if you think of yourself as a very young person, everything you learn is kind of exciting. That I've learned this new thing. Literally, it's an excitement every time you do it. And even at my age, there's excitement to learning. If I go see my buddy Adrian Bijan, who's a very abstract thinker, I thought, wow, he's bringing up something that's so abstract that nobody ever thought about, including me. This is a lot of fun. So ignorance is not bliss. Conversely, learning creates excitement, and as Bijan would bring out, when you're with friends and people and colleagues, that excitement turns into positive outcomes over time. So,
And is this part of the reason why you admire entrepreneurs and value entrepreneurship so much? Like the freedom of the individual to make goods or provide services that really impact a person's quality of life in a positive way?
yeah, it's why you can't really create entrepreneurs. They create themselves, but what you can do is instruct them in the skills, whether they're manual, intellectual, emotionally, moral, that support their efforts. Because if you have a completely ignorant entrepreneur, they're probably not going to be real successful. If you have an entrepreneur that's loaded with information and they have a team of people that are smarter about a whole lot of things, more knowledgeable, then they're in the game. And that's how these entrepreneurial companies operate. So when I say somebody, we're going to come to our entrepreneur, we're going to teach you to be an entrepreneur, I'm just laughing out loud. It's silly. I'm going to teach you to be a great artist? Really? We may be able to assist you with that, but you can't teach certain things. Someone said one time, you can't teach it, but you can learn it. So you could take an artist and saying, and this is how our art works, how music works, and how everything works. You look at the master, could I do some of that? How would I do it? So this whole idea, this classic education, it's just so beautiful and so powerful. And yet, in the modern era, we're willing to take some of the most high value things we've had in our history, 2,500 year history, and just put it in the trash one day. We took all those books out of the library and we burnt them in France, right? And we cut the heads off all the people who were the librarians and the intellectuals. Yeah, we got that problem solved. Think of how outrageous this is.
And there are certain ideas, like ones that allowed full growth in the French Revolution, but ideas traditionally associated with like a conservative position, contemporary conservative position. So ideas like limited government, how government ought to function, certain ideas of the human person. Where's the overlap? Where do we find these ideas in the tradition? Ideas that are commonly associated with contemporary conservatism. Dr. Noland, would you field this question for us?
Well, I think there's probably a lot that you could say, but a couple of things that come to mind. One is, you mentioned the Founding Fathers, and it's in one of the Federalist Papers. I think it's 11. I don't have them all memorized or anything, but where the line about if men were angels, there'd be no need for government, and basically if government were full of angels, then there you see this very real sense of the understanding of history that when you give people power, is dangerous, even if they are good people. And Washington famously was thought of himself as maybe this Cincinnatus figure. But what's interesting about it, there was only one, right? In Washington, one reason why he's such his standout is because he actually gave up the power, right? So I think that would be an argument for a limited government right there, just the awareness that what makes somebody just supremely virtuous and intelligent simply by putting them in government. And so they should just make you just naturally wary anytime you see the sense that government can be the answer to things. And then like you mentioned Burke, in the sense that these institutions that have developed over the years, they're really, really important. And the bigger the government gets, the more it crowds out those institutions. And those institutions are really essential for character formation. And again, you see this in Tocqueville, right? And I think one thing I just read the last couple of days that's interesting is, so both of our leading presidential candidates are really big fans of price controls, it seemed like. Well, Diocletian tried this and it was an epic fail. And so you can see this all the way through history.
What year was that?
I think it was like 301 that he introduced this edict with all these price controls, which was interesting because, so I'll give you real quick economics that I just learned. So he devalued the currency because he was trying to inflate his wealth. And so they started making the coins impure. Yeah. So there was rapid inflation. And he thought, well, this is terrible. The prices are too high. So I know what I'll do. I'll just cap the prices. And it was just a disaster, right? As you might expect, with shortages and of course the penalty for overcharging was death. So it had a little bit more weight than maybe some stuff now. But what's interesting there is, again, just another example of if you have some sense of history, you have a sense of Again, humility, the dangers of hubris in government, the dangers of placing too much power in anybody, right? And you can see this with both parties now, where they want to enact either executive orders or policies that it's like they are so short-sighted that they can't imagine that the other side might eventually get in power.
Diocletian found out the hard way that the imperium does not extend to the marketplace, that you can't just command that prices are going to be this and not that.
Right. And so I think throughout history, and then so again, if you were thinking about classical education as learning about human nature and maybe about tendencies, we're talking at lunch about unintended consequences, it gives you a great deal of a sense of to be cautious. And again, this is the lesson of Burke throughout, right? Is basically be cautious, be careful about what you do, because you could tear down a fence that might be doing some really important work.
You brought up a really important point, this idea of human nature. And we're all trustworthy only to a point. So if you think you appoint somebody to do anything, you put them on a board of directors, it's incredibly hard because of human weakness, okay, which we all have inside of us. And the second, so to me, that's one of the most important parts of classic education, what you brought up right there. Humans are weak. If we were Adam and Eve, we may have eaten the apple, and we probably would have eaten the apple. High probability, right? But we can say, oh, I wouldn't eat that apple. I would, no, not me. I wanted to renew that quote of Alfred Kahn. So Alfred Kahn is the chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB. He's a liberal, a hardcore liberal. And he said, I've come to this conclusion. My job should be eliminated. The CAB should be eliminated. Here's the reason why. He says, the best regulation in the world is no match for a chaotic free market. Think about that. So companies and schools are governments because they set rules and they make people do things. And companies have a higher vested interest in doing the right thing if they want to stay in business, because they can be sued under tort law, under any types of harms. If the government doesn't show up in Western North Carolina, FEMA doesn't show up, no harm, no foul. Literally. No repercussions whatsoever, okay? They're sitting on the couch in Washington. And so Newt Gingrich sent me an email this morning, what we should do? And I said, get rid of FEMA. Because then we would know we have to take care of our own problems. This is not complicated. This is simple stuff.
If Newt Gingrich emailed me, I would have told him the same thing.
I'll tell him I have a second vote. They have affirmation.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add some more wisdom from the ancients that we see in more modern kind of American conservative government, and that is our own Constitution, which I think is a deeply conservative document in the sense that we've been using the word. And if you look through that document, there are multiple instances where the ideas for the structure of government and even for the idea of a written constitution come directly from ancient writings. So Xenophon, Plato, Aristotle, Polybius, and Cicero. Cicero is everywhere in the Constitution. But I think the thing that you see come up so often is in those ancient writings, in multiple places, is the idea of checks and balances. And of course, the very idea of checks and balances is born from that same thing we've been talking about, that men are not angels, and therefore you have to have those checks and balances. And they devised a way to do that thousands of years ago by having, they called it either mixed government, or they had different ways of phrasing it. But having an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch of government comes from ancient writers. Cicero has in his writings the idea that you ban ex post facto laws, that you have the rule of law. And so, all over our Constitution, we have the ancient writers. And so I think Madison must have taken Jefferson's advice and read those hundreds of books.
And we've talked a lot about this, that being a conservative most likely implies an understanding of human nature, involves an understanding of human nature as being limited, fallen, and that really creates that need to really improve your character, to read great books, to really push yourselves, but also having some humility, understanding that you could very easily fall, really providing those checks and balances on yourself before you go out and attempt something so big and so grand. The progressives on the other side of the political aisle tend to maybe discount those views of human nature. Human nature really isn't fallen. Timeless truths, biblical wisdom really don't apply, especially in the modern industrial age. I mean, you mentioned the Constitution is an inherently conservative document, and the progressives, the one thing that they're saying is that the Constitution is outmoded. It doesn't apply anymore. It's obsolete. We really need to move forward and into we need to progress, but it doesn't seem like they're really advancing human flourishing and human happiness in a meaningful way.
Right. I think the one characteristic of progressivism that I think is the key to understanding it is they believe that humans are perfectible, that through modern technology, through progress, we are going to get to a utopia. And I think that conservatives understand deep down that is not possible.
Mm-hmm. And so take care of the things that you really have value, that you really have control over. So your family, your workplace, churches and other local civic institutions. You mentioned Tocqueville and public associations, groups of concerned citizens getting together and really just fixing something that if the government tried it, they probably wouldn't do as good a job. Or perhaps like you Mr. Luddy, like starting a school in the back offices of Captivair that must have seemed really crazy at the time. But, you were asked to do something, you could do it, and so you just did it.
Yeah, if you go back to the 50s when I was in grade school, and Charles Murray wrote a book about this called Coming Apart. And it almost perfectly aligns with my remembrance. So we had a $20,000 house. The people I knew that were really rich, and I still know them, had an $80,000 house. So they were a little better off, they had a little nicer clothes, they had a little more discretion, but it wasn't like this. So if you look at virtually every family in the 50s, at least from an economic standpoint, was a conservative, literally. There were some exceptions. Once now, somebody that has $100,000, well, there's no $100,000. They have a $500,000, $500,000 house. Somebody else has a $80 million house. So that delta has moved way out. As people gain more money, they say, I don't need the founding, I don't need liberal education, I don't need God, I don't need anybody. I have power of the checkbook. And to me, that's what's corrupted our society and created this sort of progressive idea as human nature doesn't count anymore. Really? Nobody with a half a brain could even make such a statement, but people say these things all day long. And as Desmond says Matthias Desmond says, the more stupid the idea, the more likely it will gain traction now in the marketplace. That's a direct quote or paraphrase from Matthias Desmond.
Well, and that just speaks to the need, reading good books and talking with people who may know just a little bit more than you do. And to me, that really gets classical education being inherently conservative, and that really what we're trying to do as educators, trying to conserve really as much class time as possible for reading and writing, discussing and learning. So in this way, does classical education lose anything by embracing the function of conserving valuable insights about human nature, historical examples from the past that may speak directly to issues that we're debating today, ideas that may or may not influence their choices in the civic and the political arena? I mean, if students go through a classical program, are they going to end up becoming conservatives? And if so, is that a bad thing? I would say that's a very good thing, right? They're conserving the things that are, have shown that by the test of time to be valuable.
I don't know. I mean, there's obviously an opportunity cost, but I don't know what it is that would be lost that would be more valuable than what's gained. I mean, maybe somebody can make the argument, but I can't think of what it would be.
I think your question about will classical education produce conservatives, I mean, there are a lot of good reasons to think yes, but then I remember that, the leaders who brought us World War I all had similar educations.
That is a great irony. all this. The people that had the education we're bringing back ended up becoming progressives, like John
Right.
Dewey.
So I think that you can't. It's very hard to predict exactly what will happen. And I think there's also a conflating factor that right now, at least in the United States, people are choosing classical education. Right? They're not given it kind of across the board by the public education system. They're choosing it, and so their parents are different. They have chosen to do something for their children that they find valuable. And so, if a student turns out in a particular way in the future, is it because the parents, or is it because of the education, or is it both? Like, I think if someone wanted to do that empirical research, it'd be hard to tease apart.
There's an old joke, and you go up to the cathedral and you say to the guy, "What are you doing?" And the first guy says, "Well, I'm laying bricks. Isn't that pretty obvious to you?" And the next guy says, "I'm building a cathedral." So from somebody with vocational skills to the highest intellectual skills, by having a classic education, they have a better understanding of the world. They can make a higher contribution to the world. And having a classic education does not guarantee somebody won't go into error. We got errors throughout 2,500 years.
That's part of the value of learning this brand of education. You find all the ways that people have messed up.
Yes.
Come back from it.
I think that's really important to say, because sometimes in venues such as this one that I've been in a number of times, there's a little bit of a self-congratulation echo chamber going on about like this classical education will just solve all our problems, and sometimes I think I'm doing my best, teaching logic, and obviously, but I mean, I think I've mentioned humility before, and you said a moment ago, the awareness that, well, we could be wrong, and that questioning and having the sense of testing your ideas against others, and that openness to inquiry, I think is really, really important. So I think classical education is really important, valuable. That's why I'm involved in it, and I'm really grateful for the school that Mr. Luddy's provided, that I get to work there. But at the same time, it's not a cure-all.
Can we sum it up in what you said before? It's human nature. We're subject to error. We're all subject to error. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter how well educated we are. It doesn't matter who our parents were. We live in a free world. We can make our own decisions, and we can make very bad decisions. And that explains why we have the progressives, at least in my mind.
Any last thoughts, gentlemen? Dr. Robinson? For those of you who attended this panel, I can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you so much to our panel participants for investigating this worthwhile and rich discussion with us. If you're interested in the unique brand of classical education that we have at Thales Academy, I would urge you to look at our website, www.thalesacademy.org. And for Thales Press, I'm Winston Brady. Until next time, stay classy and stay classical.